£40, said the elder Tice, sliding the paper across the cold table, as though he were selling off a lame horse, and you'll be doing us a kindness to take her at all. The Duke of Kelbourne did not touch the paper. He sat very still in that grey, fireless drawing-room, and let the silence stretch, until the man across from him began to fidget with his cuffs. Isidore had come here expecting a negotiation over a debt. He had not expected to be offered a woman as one offers a burden one is glad to be rid of. "You speak of your daughter," the Duke said at last. His voice was low and even, and it carried more weight unraised than other men's did shouting. "I speak of Magdalen, yes." Tice had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, then buried it under bluster. "Your Grace will understand. She cannot walk. Has not, since the fever took her at 17. No man of standing will have her, and we cannot keep her forever. She is a difficulty. We had thought, given what is owed between our families, that you might take her off our hands and the debt forgiven, and the £40 besides, for her keeping. A charity, if you like. No one will think the less of you. No one expects you to truly want her." It was the last sentence that did it. Isidore had walked into this house intending to be cold and brief, to settle accounts and leave. But that sentence, "No one expects you to truly want her," landed in him like a stone dropped into a still well, and the ripples that went out from it were not what the elder Tice had bargained for. They were anger, a clean, quiet, formidable anger. "Where is she?" the Duke asked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your daughter. Where is she? You have spent a quarter-hour discussing her as though she were furniture in an unheated room. I should like to meet the woman before I am told what I do or do not want." Tice blinked, plainly thrown. Such men, the Duke had found, were always thrown when asked to treat the thing they were selling as a person. A servant was sent. There was a delay, low voices in the corridor, the soft complaint of wheels over an uneven floor, and then the door opened. She came into the room in a chair of dark carved wood, pushed by a tired-looking maid, and the first thing the Duke noticed was that she was not looking at the floor. She might have been forgiven for it, a woman brought in to be inspected like livestock, but Magdalen Tice held her head level and looked straight at him, and her eyes were the steadiest thing in that cold house. They were grey and clear and faintly, devastatingly amused, as though she had already guessed exactly the shape of the conversation she had interrupted. "Your Grace," she said, "you will forgive me for not rising. It is a failing of mine my family never tires of mentioning." Isidore stood. He had not meant to. It was not done to stand for a woman being sold to you. But he was on his feet before he had decided to be, and he inclined his head with a gravity he reserved for very few. "Miss Tice, the fault is entirely your family's, for keeping you in the corridor while better company was wasted on me in here." Something flickered across her face, surprise, and then a swift, suppressed delight, as if she had not expected to be answered in her own coin. Her father coughed and looked between them, sensing the ground had shifted under him and not knowing how. "Then we are agreed," Tice said hastily. "The £40, the debt." "We are not agreed," the Duke said, "to anything you have proposed." He turned from the man entirely, as though he had ceased to exist, and addressed himself only to her. "Miss Tice, I find I have been summoned here under a false understanding. I was told I was being offered a difficulty. I was not told I was being offered a conversation worth having. I will not buy you, because you are not a thing to be bought. But if you wish to leave this house, and I think you do, I will take you from it gladly, and you will go as a guest under my protection, owing me nothing, free to leave again whenever you choose." The amusement drained out of her grey eyes, and for a moment something raw and unguarded looked out of them instead. He understood, in that moment, exactly how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her, as though her wishes were a thing that mattered. "You do not know me," she said quietly. "No," the Duke agreed. "That is rather the point of coming away, is it not? So that I might." There was a fine, worn shawl about her shoulders, the only good thing in that grey room, and she drew it closer with hands that did not tremble. My family, she said with a small, dry precision, has spent 8 years informing me that I am a misfortune to be managed. You should know that before you decide I am worth the carriage ride. Your family, said the Duke of Kelbourne, is a pack of fools, and I have just bought my way out of their company at a price I consider extremely cheap. Will you come? She looked at him a long moment. Then Magdalen Tice smiled, a real smile, unhurried, the smile of a clever woman who has decided to wager on something at last, and said, "Yes, I believe I will." He did not let the maid carry her to the carriage. He did it himself. He had not asked permission exactly. He had simply crossed the room and crouched and said, low enough that only she could hear, "May I?" and waited, his dark eyes on hers, until she gave the smallest nod. Then he lifted her from the carved chair as easily and as carefully as one lifts something one has waited a long while to be allowed to hold. She was lighter than he expected and stiffer in his arms than she would later be, braced against the old habit of being handled like cargo. "You may put me down at the step," she said. "I am perfectly capable of arranging myself." "I am certain you are," he said, and carried her the whole way down the cold front steps into the watery light, where his footman stood holding the door, carefully not staring. He settled her against the cushions with more gentleness than such a large man seemed built for, then went back himself for the wheeled chair, refusing to let it be left behind. "It is yours," he said when she protested. "It goes where you go." The Kelbourne estate was everything her father's house was not. Warm, fires in every grate, candles enough to read by, long carpeted galleries and wide doorways, and, she discovered over the following days, an astonishing number of small thoughtful alterations that appeared without comment. A ramp of polished oak laid quietly over the 3 steps to the library. A bell-pull moved to where her hand could reach it. A second chair, lighter than her father's grim contraption, made by the estate carpenter to a design the Duke had described to him, lower in the arm, easier in the wheel, with a little carved bird on the headrest because, the carpenter said, his Grace had asked particularly that it should not look like an invalid's chair, but like a lady's. She found the Duke in the library most evenings. She had expected, at first, to be an obligation he visited out of duty, a charity, as her father had said, that no one would think less of him for. She found instead a man who argued with her about books until the candles guttered. "You are wrong about the Greeks," she informed him one night, 3 weeks in, the firelight warm on the fine shawl he had given her to replace the worn one. "I am frequently wrong," Isidore said. "I should be glad to hear the particulars." And she told him at length, with a swift dry wit that turned and flashed like a fish in clear water, and he sat across from her with his chin on his hand and watched her talk and did not, for whole minutes together, hear a word of the argument, only the music of a mind unfolding that had been folded shut for 8 cold years. He was careful never to praise her courage. He had learned, from a single sharp look early on, that she despised being admired for the simple act of continuing to exist. So he praised instead her wickedly accurate impressions of his pompous neighbours, and her chess, which was merciless, and the way she had reorganized his entire library in an afternoon, and pronounced his former system the work of a man who has never once needed to find a book in a hurry. "You are laughing at me," he observed, the night she beat him at chess for the 4th time running. "I am," Magdalen agreed serenely. "It is one of the great pleasures of my new situation. At home no one dared be laughed at, in case it gave me ideas above my station." "And your station here?" She considered the board, and then him, and the lightness went out of her voice though not out of her eyes. "I have not yet worked out my station here," she said honestly. "You took me from that house, and you have given me warmth and books and a chair with a bird on it. And you ask me nothing, and you require nothing of me, and I confess, Your Grace, that I do not understand you. I keep waiting to learn what I cost." The Duke was quiet. The fire shifted. On his hand, the heavy gold of the signet ring caught the light. "You cost me," he said slowly, "a great deal. You cost me my comfortable certainty that I was a hard man with nothing left to lose. You cost me my peace, because I now spend my days inventing reasons to come to this library. And you cost me, I find, the very last of my conviction that I should marry for advantage, because it has become entirely impossible to imagine spending my evenings across from anyone whose mind is duller than yours, which is to say, anyone else alive." He turned the ring on his finger once and looked up at her. "That is what you cost me, Magdalene. I am not asking you to repay it. I am asking whether you might consent to ruin me a little further." She did not answer at once. He saw her weigh it, saw her test it for pity, for charity, for the soft condescending kindness she had been braced against her whole life, and saw the moment she found none. "You should know," she said, and her voice was not quite steady now, "that I will never walk to you across a room, that whatever this is, you will always be the one who has to come the last of the way." "Then I shall come the last of the way every evening of my life," said the Duke of Kelbourne, "and count myself the luckier man for getting there first." And he rose and crossed the warm, bright room and knelt beside her chair so that for once he was not looking down at her at all, but level, eye to eye, the way she had looked at him in that grey, cold room when she would not bow her head. "Will you stay? Not as a guest, as my wife, as the woman I did not know I was waiting to be ruined by." Magdalene Tice, whom her family had bartered away for £40 because they were certain no one could truly want her, reached out and laid her hand against the side of his face and felt the breath go out of him at her touch. "Yes," she said, "but you will have to carry me to the altar, you understand. I refuse to be married standing up like everyone else. I should hate to be ordinary about it." He laughed, a real, helpless, astonished laugh, and turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. He did carry her to the altar, in the end, in a gown the colour of warm cream, the fine shawl about her shoulders, and the little carved bird tucked into the wheeled chair that waited at the front of the chapel for her, polished and garlanded and treated by the whole household as a throne. The county talked of it for years, the great brooding Duke of Kelbourne, who could have married any fortune in the kingdom, lifting his bride into his arms before God and gentry as though she were the single most precious thing he had ever been permitted to hold. And in the warm evenings after, when the fires were lit and the candles burned low, and she beat him at chess and laughed at him for it, he would sometimes look across at her and think of £40, and of a man who had been certain no one could want her, and he would feel the old clean anger flicker, and then fade into something steadier and far larger. For he had not taken her in charity, and he had not loved her out of pity. He had been handed a treasure by people too cold to recognize it, and he had simply, gratefully carried it home.